in pieces. Some of you may recall the strange affair of the Phantom of the Opera. Gentlemen!
Hi, this is Marcy Casterline. This is the long version of my discussion of Phantom of the Opera, my in-depth analysis of what Phantom of the Opera meant to my mother, and it has to do with the forbidden father. This experience is what gave me the idea for movie therapy. It was a deeply meaningful experience that transformed my understanding of my mother and allowed me to begin to forgive her for all the trouble and heartache she'd caused in our family. I'm sure the COVID years are full of extraordinary, life-changing stories from all of us. This is one of mine. My 96-year-old mother was estranged from all her family by her own choice, if you can call her emotionally impaired mind capable of choice. She had refused to call me for years because even the sound of my voice made her feel judged, which was unbearable to her. When I did call her, she motor-mouthed the entire time, never listening to me, never telling me anything important or the truth about what was going on in her life. She was that terrified of the power of disapproval. When we did speak, she would tell me stories about our shared past that were completely distorted, always starring herself as heroine. I'd been there. I knew what had really happened. It was all very strange. What ghosts were haunting her mind? Well, I was soon to meet those ghosts. My mother was a frozen person, unable to give or receive physical affection. She couldn't even wear tight clothes because any constriction was unbearable to her. As a child, I guess I never really noticed how frozen she was when she would hug me so stiffly. It was only many years later when my father was in the hospital hovering between life and death, and I watched her strange, stiff hug and cold kiss in what might presumably be goodbye forever. Then it dawned on me how very frozen and unable to be affectionate she was. I knew from celebrating many Christmases with her and my father how incapable she was of being happy. I grew up hating Christmas because for my mother it was the most painful time of the year. She went crazy for everything at Christmas. We had every decoration possible, and no matter what we did, it didn't make her happy. So she was even unhappier. She was unable to experience any but the most fleeting pleasure. Trying to experience pleasure made her even more depressed than her usual depressed state, because it only emphasized how happy things failed to make her happy. The term anhedonia probably applies to her. But why was she so frozen? How did a person get like that and spend their whole life without being able to give or receive physical affection? It was a tragic mystery to me. She was an emotional mess who functioned fairly well. She was just one more example of how parents can unwittingly ruin their children's lives. Just before COVID hit, she took a fall and ended up in a wheelchair and was diagnosed with heart failure. She went into hospice in late 2019 but didn't tell me. I was the only family member geographically close enough to her to get there, having just moved to Colorado. My plan was to drive out there as soon as I had a couple of days of good weather. It was a very snowy winter that year, so it was early March 2020 before it looked clear enough to make the journey. I remember my millennial son telling me I'd better get going because it looked like they were going to shut the nation down. I laughed at him and I said, "Oh, you millennials, you just panic over everything. They'll never do that." Of course, several days later, when I arrived, I was immediately put into 2-week quarantine because Colorado was a hot spot. I will never forget the look on my mother's face as she wheeled herself to the door and opened it to find me standing there. I hadn't told her I was coming because I was sure she would be furious and forbid me from coming. In reality, she was thrilled when she saw me. Happy tears ran down her face. She was dying, and she wasn't going to be alone. Knowing how unpredictable my mother could be, I had come armed with the names of nearby motels in case she refused to let me in. Yeah, she was that crazy. Being in quarantine with your crazy mother who was dying turned out to be a gift from God. We were forced to deal with each other in order to survive. We went through many very difficult times together as I learned all about her caring, needs, and routines, and we tried to figure out her future. I had thought of spending at most a month or two with her, but when the nursing homes closed due to COVID, things got complicated. I ended up staying for 8 months until December when she passed away. Facing certain death in the near future, my mother dropped a lot of her difficult behaviors. Not all of them by any means, but she did become a little easier to deal with. But one of the most extraordinary events for me, the one which changed my life and my understanding of my mother, and inspired me to do movie therapy, had to do with Phantom of the Opera. Mom was eagerly and excitedly looking forward to the upcoming, free, uninterrupted telecast of the 25th anniversary production of Phantom of the Opera from Royal Albert Hall. This was to be a very great event in her life. She'd seen Phantom a couple of times on stage as it toured the country, but seemingly she couldn't see it enough. I actually dreaded being trapped by her side watching this musical for 3 whole hours. I was familiar with the music, which had always seemed a bit overwrought to me. But as there was no way to avoid it, given her feverish excitement, I was pressed into service as her companion. Why my continually depressed mother should be so enthusiastically devoted to a musical that seemed so tragic was a mystery to me, but it was a mystery that I was soon to solve for both of us. From the beginning, to my great surprise, I was charmed by the production. Unlike many filmed stage productions, this one had been very skillfully filmed and edited, with the camera unobtrusively in all the right places at the right time. The evocative opening is of a 1911 auction of props from the Paris Opera House. The stage set creates a feeling that is eerie and sentimental at the same time. Of course, the high point of the auction is the thrilling theatricality of the giant, brilliantly lit chandelier exploding overhead and swooping above a gasping audience. It was absolutely breathtaking, even on film. That shock of the swooping chandelier was one of my first clues to my mother's inner life. As I said, she was a person who was emotionally frozen. It took a lot to awaken her sensibility, and the chandelier acrobatics absolutely gobsmacked her to life. From then on, she was quivering with excitement, definitely beginning to unfreeze. When they auctioned the old-fashioned music box with the little monkey on top, clearly we were going back to childhood memories and feelings. Phantom is the longest-running musical in Broadway history, so I'm sure it moves and pleases the audience in many different ways. On this occasion, my mother and I shared a very special experience and a meaning very specific to her personal history. As a result of our COVID isolation while living with her, we'd gone over her scrapbooks from as far back as high school, college, and wartime letters and many other treasures from her youth in St. Louis. These had given me fresh insights into what her youth had actually been. Consequently, her vivid emotional responses as the Phantom story unfolded enabled me to relive with her her own very difficult childhood story and to viscerally understand for the first time why she was so frozen. The music is hypnotically and swooningly romantic and achingly lovelorn. It's also tinged with dark Gothic horror. The effect is magical and enthralling. Note the red rose in the poster. Red in fairy tales and stories is usually a symbol of sexuality. Little Red Riding Hood is a prime example. So here we are in a memory play about a young woman ardently remembering her father as her guide and guardian, who has sent her the angel of music. The angel her father sent is the Phantom of the Opera, the ghost in her story, who has mysteriously taught her how to sing beautifully. He is the angel who has shown her how to express her true, talented self. This was an emotional release my frozen mother was never able to enjoy in life. Anytime she tried to show her feelings, she was painfully self-conscious and overly self-critical, as she was overly critical of all our family with disastrous results from my youngest brother who died very young. The phantom steals Christine away in a trance and sings the music of the night to her. He tells our heroine to surrender to her darkest dreams and let her spirit soar. He entices her to let her soul take her where she longs to be. Let her darkest side give in to the power of the music of the night. Listening and being swept along by the seductive music, my mother's youthful feelings came into clear focus as they never had before. What were the seductive dark dreams that haunted my mother and were still bottled up inside her? I knew that my mother was my grandmother's darling and had seen in my mother's scrapbook evidence of that favoritism in glamorous trips, nice clothes, special activities, as well as the photos of several very eligible young men my grandmother had picked out as appropriate catches for my mother. My mother's younger sister once told me that it seemed as if my grandmother had cast a spell over my mother. That younger sister was the acknowledged favorite of my grandfather, which had its own problems. The two sisters had never gotten along very well, but I had always suspected that my grandmother, who was very tall and broadly built, and not what anyone would call pretty, had decided to live out all her social ambitions through my mother. I believe my grandmother fixated on my mother as her special child, the one she would turn into a big social success. My mother was tall, intelligent, and quite pretty. She was to be my grandmother's alter ego. My domineering grandmother was going to do everything in her considerable power to make sure her daughter was perfectly groomed in every way to fit into the upper class, so she would be snapped up by some smart young fellow with money and position. Everything, that is, except let my mother be herself. My grandmother was a bully in the sense that she tolerated no weakness and no arguments or opposition to her will. She considered all illnesses to be in your head and would accept no excuses for anything that might be construed as malingering. She was a first-generation German who loudly scorned the old world ways where men could swat their wives and children to get respect and obedience. Nobody was ever going to swat my grandmother. No way. The stories of my grandmother very effectively intimidating all sorts of authority figures were many and proudly retold. She was one tough cookie. I had always been pretty sure that her inflexible demands on my mother had been a real strain on Mom. No one could have lived up to my grandmother's expectations. When we had looked at my mother's old albums, I could see these were not happy memories for her, not even all her successes. Rather, they put her in a bad mood. I think once again she began to feel like the failure she always felt in my grandmother's eyes. Marrying my Brooklyn-born World War II Army Air Corps father was probably the most defiant act of my mother's life. This constant pressure to be my grandmother's ideal daughter instilled a strong power of resistance in my mother's personality, just to survive. This lasted all her life and actually got worse. It was part of what had frozen her physically. Everyone had to agree absolutely with her and do her bidding or be banished forever until they admitted she had been right. I could fill books with stories of Crazy Marge. However, I had never thought about where her father fit into this picture of her damaging childhood. Now, as the Phantom Opera progressed, I could feel my mother's deep sense of longing, very like that of the heroine, for her dead father. Christine even visits the cemetery where her father is buried to free herself from the dark phantom. I begin to wonder if the phantom didn't represent my mother's deep and unrequited desire for her father's love. And I had recently seen my mother making sure that there were flowers on her father's grave for his birthday. Interestingly, she told me she never sent flowers to her mother's grave. All the illusions about going to the underground dwelling of the phantom and dreaming in the dark, to letting her spirit soar, to listening to her own music, all these hints made a very clear emotional picture of my mother's unconscious and her long-suppressed childhood yearning for her father's love, a love so plaintively and powerfully expressed by Lloyd Webber's unforgettable music. And the phantom represents a powerful masculine figure who might have successfully stood up against my domineering grandmother. Evidently, my mother's real father lost that battle very early on. My mother's desire for her father's love had to be mentally and physically repressed, hidden underground, or she would not only lose all the love and devotion of my grandmother would have become her implacable enemy, and believe me, no one wanted my grandmother as their enemy. So much of my mother's self-destructive and strange behavior was beginning to make sense. Even as a child, I was aware of the friction between my grandparents. There was never any violence. It was a truce. They were fond and civil, but distant with each other. But their marriage failure and character flaws destroyed my mother's chances at happiness, even though technically she had everything that anyone could ever want, and she knew it. Her misery and all the problems that flowed from her childhood destroyed any chance of happiness for our family. Since the truth could never be spoken or acted upon, nothing ever went right. That's why my movie therapy idea and theater and all the arts mean so much to me. Responding to art is one of the few ways we have to open our hearts to new ideas about ourselves and life, and it's a good way to understand the problems of our family and friends in order to deal with them more successfully. The better you understand yourself, the better you can understand others. My parents missed so much love and so much fun that we could have had, and for no good reason. Their emotional lives were entirely constricted by their emotionally poverty-stricken narratives and their complete misreadings of family events. They experienced very little of the joy of living that should have been theirs or ours. As my mother and I watched this magnificent and very moving production together, shedding tears and glorying in the bittersweet ending, we experienced my mother's very sad childhood together. I, feeling all her pain, but knowing it was pointless to tell a dying 96-year-old woman that the reason she had so unexplainably moved back to her early childhood home in St. Louis, and that the reason she always sent flowers to my grandfather's grave and not to my grandmother's was right there, so movingly and entrancingly expressed on the screen. She felt the truth of it intuitively, but too late. And even more mysteriously, I believe our spirits were activated by this shared emotional experience, so much so that I saw her soul ascend to heaven one night. This was a deeply emotionally moving experience. I knew what her life had been. I knew the terrible things she'd done to our family again and again, always in the grip of decades of frustrated, angry frozenness. I found myself lying in bed weeping for her and praying for forgiveness for her, because I knew what she had suffered, and I also knew how evil and destructive she could be. Now you probably think I'm a nut. I know. Sometimes I think I'm a nut. But these crazy things keep happening to me. If you read Bedeviled, you will see that it took me years to accept that there is a spiritual world all around us and interacting with us all the time. To me, these events are embarrassingly emotional. I'm kind of a lightweight emotionally, I guess. But I do feel it's my responsibility to talk about these things because I think others feel them too. We need to reaffirm their truth to ourselves and to the world. But no matter what you think about whether I saw my mother's soul or not, Phantom of the Opera may have something to say to you too. And I hope when you watch the things that you enjoy watching, or look at the pictures you enjoy, or listen to the music you enjoy, you let it speak to your spirit and see what it's telling you about yourself. That's the only way you can learn about who you are while you're here on Earth, or it's one of the ways anyway. I mean, you also have your experience, but your experiences get interpreted through the culture that you respond to. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you find this interesting.